On Sunday, May 27, 1984, 18-year-old Laura Salmon left her dorm at Middle Tennessee State University, got into her beige Oldsmobile, and headed down the main road that cut through the college town of Murfreesboro. About 10 minutes later, Laura parked her car in a movie theater, stepped outside, and then waved to a young man who was waiting for her over at the box office. The young man, whose name was Dan Goodwin, was one of the new friends Laura had made since starting her freshman year of college about 8 months earlier. And this was the first time they'd gone out together, just the two of them. Laura wasn't sure if this was a date or not, but Dan's invitation for dinner and a movie definitely made it seem like it could be. She and Dan said hello, and Dan told her he had not gotten the tickets yet, because he didn't know what movie she wanted to see. Laura smiled. A lot of guys she knew would have just picked whatever movie they wanted and not worried about what she wanted at all. The two of them settled on The Natural, a new baseball movie, and they bought some tickets. Dan was a gentleman the whole time, opening doors for Laura, paying for everything, and getting the snacks that she wanted. And when they walked out after the movie ended, Laura was having a good time and was looking forward to dinner. Laura and Dan ate at a restaurant in the same shopping center as the movie theater, and they spent most of the meal getting to know each other better. Laura said college had been a big adjustment from high school, even though she still lived pretty close to her mom. But for the most part, she had enjoyed her newfound freedom. She asked Dan if he had plans for what he wanted to do after college. Laura knew this was still a long way off, but she was already set on her career. She loved performing in plays, and she wanted to be an actress. Dan said he wasn't quite sure, but whenever he thought about it, he always came back to law enforcement. He thought maybe he could be a police detective. Laura laughed. She couldn't think of two more opposite careers than theater actor and cop, but despite their different life ambitions, they got along really well and had a great night. After dinner, Dan walked Laura back to her car, and they said they'd see each other soon. On the drive home, Laura kept laughing to herself. After a whole night out with Dan, she still had no idea if what they'd just done was actually a date or not. But she didn't want to worry about it. Dan was nice and they were friends, and that was not always the case with some of the guys she met in class or at frat parties. And she wasn't necessarily looking for something serious. She'd had a long-term boyfriend for most of high school, but college was different. She didn't want to tie herself down. Early on May 30th, 1984, 3 days after Laura had gone to the movies with Dan, she woke up to the loud beep of her alarm clock. She wanted to yell at herself for staying up so late the night before. She'd had a great time dancing at a local club and hanging out with her date, but now she was going to pay for it. She had an early shift at the supermarket where she worked part-time. Laura barely pulled herself out of bed and then got ready. She put on a pair of blue jeans, a t-shirt, and a black jacket, and then headed out the door for work. The following day, around 5 p.m., a farmer in Murfreesboro drove his truck down a road that ran across the acres of property that he owned. He looked out into a large hayfield near a rock quarry, and he saw something that immediately annoyed him. Somebody had left a pile of clothes out in the middle of the grass. Finding stuff like this had actually become routine because local college and high school kids had turned this part of the farmer's land into a place to party. Now, at least once a week, he had to go pick up trash and collect empty beer cans. The farmer parked on the side of the road and got out of his truck. He slammed the door behind him and walked through some tall grass towards the clothes on the ground. But as he got closer, he stopped and just began shaking his head. He hoped his eyes were playing tricks on him and he wasn't really seeing what he thought he saw. The farmer took a few steps closer and then ran right back to his truck. He sped down the road to his house and he called 911. About a half an hour later, Detective Bob Asbury and two deputies from the Rutherford County Sheriff's Department pulled up to the hayfield and got out of their cars. The farmer had come back and was waiting for them. The farmer ominously pointed to a spot a few yards out in the high grass. The deputies stayed back to ask him some questions, and Detective Asbury put on his gloves and walked out into the field. And there, lying in the grass, he saw the dead body of a young woman. She was nude except for a bra, and her legs were spread open. A woman's black jacket covered most of her face, and lying on top of the jacket were 2 pairs of blue jeans. Asbury couldn't be sure, but the amount of bugs crawling nearby and the condition of her skin made it look like she'd been out there for a while, maybe overnight. Asbury crouched down next to the young woman's body. He could see deep wounds on the side of her head, the kind that usually indicate blunt force trauma. And the detective saw something clutched in her right hand. It was a pair of women's underwear. That detail, along with how her body was laying and the fact that she was almost naked, made Asbury think that this young woman had very likely been sexually assaulted before someone killed her. Asbury eyed the jacket covering her face, and that didn't seem too strange to him. Sometimes killers covered their victims because they couldn't bear to look at what they'd done. But the detective had no idea why somebody had also laid 2 pairs of jeans on her body. He carefully removed the jeans and then lifted the jacket to get a look at the woman's face. He saw deep bruises that looked similar to the other ones on her head, and it didn't take long for Asbury to find a potential murder weapon. He scanned the grass around the body, and he saw a couple of rocks caked with what looked like dried blood. Asbury was confident that one or both of these rocks had been used to beat this young woman to death. The detective stood up and picked up the jeans off the ground, 1 pair at a time. The first pair were men's jeans. Based on the length, they appeared to belong to someone who was at least 6 feet tall. The second pair were women's jeans, and they looked like they could be the victims. Asbury reached inside one of the pockets, and he pulled out a student ID from Middle Tennessee State University. The photo on this ID matched the victim. This young woman was Laura Salmon. Detective Asbury and the deputies worked with a Tennessee State forensics team for hours out in the field. But the only major forensic evidence they found was the blood on the rocks and also the blood spatter on both pairs of jeans. This was 1984, so DNA testing was not used by police yet. But the forensics team would take the jeans and the samples from the rocks to the lab to determine blood type, and to see if they had samples from one or potentially more than one person. That night, when Asbury returned to the station, he found a message waiting for him on his desk. Laura's car had been located at the supermarket where she worked, a few miles away from where her body had been found. It was already getting late, but Asbury had no intention of stopping yet. So, he headed across town to the supermarket and found a couple of deputies waiting for him next to a beige Oldsmobile. The detective shined his flashlight into the driver's side window, and immediately something caught his attention. The driver's seat was pushed all the way back, like someone very tall had been driving. Asbury knew Laura was relatively short, and he knew the men's jeans he'd found near her body most likely belonged to someone much taller than her. So Asbury wondered if maybe the killer had sexually assaulted and murdered Laura, left his pants at the scene, and then driven Laura's car back to the supermarket. If that was the case, it indicated that Laura's killer knew her, or at least knew enough about her to know where she worked. The detective and the deputies did a full search of the car, but nothing else really jumped out. So, after the search, Asbury headed inside the store, and he quickly found a cashier who said she had worked with Laura the previous day. She said that she and Laura had both clocked in at 8 a.m. and worked a 5-hour shift. Afterward, they walked outside together, where Laura got in her car and drove off. Asbury asked this cashier if someone had maybe been waiting by Laura's car for her, but the cashier said she didn't see anybody, and Laura had not mentioned to her that she was meeting up with anyone. Detective Asbury walked back outside and headed to his car. If he was right, a tall man who knew Laura was the last person to drive her car. So he needed to speak to somebody who might know who that man was. The following morning, Detective Asbury met with Laura's mother at her house. Laura's mom had gotten the news about her daughter the night before, and Asbury could tell she hadn't slept since. He didn't want to stay long or push Laura's mother too much, so he offered his condolences and then got right to the point. He said he was looking for a tall man who knew Laura well enough to know where she worked. In his opinion, this guy was probably Laura's close friend or a current or past romantic partner. Laura's mom didn't hesitate. She said she knew someone who fit that description perfectly, a 17-year-old named Kyle Gilly who had been Laura's high school boyfriend. That afternoon, still less than 24 hours since Laura's body had been found, Detective Asbury led Kyle and his stepfather into a conference room at the sheriff's station. Since Kyle was a minor, Asbury had made sure he had a guardian with him when he came in for questioning. Asbury noticed right away that Kyle looked to be at least 6'2" tall, and he was a big guy too, filled out, not skinny and gangly like a lot of teenagers. He was also very quiet. But without much prodding, Kyle said he'd heard about Laura's death and he was upset about it. The two of them had been together a long time in high school, and they were still close. Asbury asked him what he meant. Were they still a couple? Kyle shook his head. They were friends and they hung out sometimes, but they were not together anymore. The detective quickly followed up and asked if that made Kyle angry. But Kyle said it didn't. He was still in high school and Laura had gone off to college. He understood why, after she had graduated, she had wanted to break up. Asbury sized Kyle up again. Physically, he was the perfect fit for this. So he asked him if Kyle had ever left a pair of jeans out on that piece of farmland where kids in town went to party. Kyle got a confused look on his face. He knew about the spot on the farm, but he had no idea about any jeans of his that had gone missing out there. Detective Asbury finished by asking Kyle where he had been on May 30th, which, as far as the detective knew, was the last time anyone had seen Laura alive. Kyle said he'd come home after school, and he'd stayed there the rest of the day. And his stepfather corroborated that. He said he and Kyle had grilled a bunch of steaks together out on the patio, and then had a barbecue with the family. Following his meeting with Kyle, Asbury continued to fixate on the pair of men's jeans he'd found covering Laura's body. He was convinced those jeans were the killers, so he just had to figure out who they belonged to. So he sent members of his team to meet with some of Laura's family and high school friends, and he drove to Laura's college campus to see if there were any other tall men in her life. Asbury walked up to the dorm room that Laura had shared with two other students. He knocked, and eventually a young woman answered. He showed her his badge, and she let him inside and said that she was one of Laura's roommates. Asbury looked around the room, and it looked like a typical dorm room shared by three young teenage girls. And this just made it hit home how tragic this murder really was. Laura was so young. The detective asked the roommate when she'd last seen Laura, and the roommate said it was the night before Laura had gone to work and never came back. That night, Laura had left the dorm to go dancing at a club with a guy she'd met. And before Asbury could even ask, the roommate said she did not know who that guy was. Detective Asbury spent the day talking to more of Laura's friends and classmates, and none of them seemed to know who she'd gone to the club with on that night. But a few of her friends pointed the detective to another young man, Dan Goodwin, who had taken Laura out to a movie and dinner a few days before she had died. Asbury tracked Dan down on campus, and the young man proved to be completely cooperative. He walked the detective through the entire day he and Laura had gone out. He said they were friends, and the date was totally casual. Nothing romantic or physical at all had happened between them. He also said he had not gone dancing with Laura at the club, and he'd never gone out to that farmland with her. By the time Detective Asbury left the campus, he had two potential suspects he at least knew something about. Dan, the casual date, and Kyle, the high school boyfriend. He also had a third potential suspect who was a total mystery, the guy Laura had gone to the club with. Asbury would follow up on alibis and keep trying to identify the man at the club, but he was already desperate to find some new piece of evidence. The following morning, 3 days after Laura's body was found, Detective Asbury sat at his desk going over Laura's autopsy report. The official cause of death was blunt force trauma, which didn't surprise Asbury at all. But there was something in this report that came as a total shock. There was evidence that Laura had recently had intercourse, but there were no physical signs that usually accompanied cases of sexual assault. This meant there was a strong chance the sex had been consensual and could have happened hours or even the day before the murder. This was not what Asbury had suspected when he'd first seen Laura's body, because she was naked from the waist down, her legs were spread, and she had underwear in her hand. So now, Asbury wondered if her killer had simply staged the scene to make it look like Laura had been sexually assaulted just to throw off investigators. If that was the case, the men's jeans might not belong to the killer at all. They could have been placed there by somebody else. In fact, if the crime scene had been staged like that, Laura's killer might not even be a man. On June 4th, 4 days after Laura's body was found, Laura's mother sat in the chapel crying as mourners filed out of Laura's funeral. Dan, the young man who had gone out with Laura just days before she died, walked up to Laura's mom and said how sorry he was and how wonderful a person Laura had been. Laura's mother instinctively pulled Dan in for a hug, and she told him to please help her find who killed her baby. Dan gave her a big hug back and then looked her in the eye and said he would. He would find Laura's killer. Over the next month, Detective Asbury and members of the Tennessee State Police continued to interview Laura's friends and acquaintances, but they weren't getting any closer to identifying her killer. And then, one afternoon, Asbury got a call from police in Nashville, Tennessee, 40 miles away. The Nashville cop said a woman had just accused a man named John Taylor of raping her, and she claimed that John had told her if she resisted, he would do to her what he did to Laura Salmon. Asbury almost couldn't believe it. It was like the huge tip he had been waiting for had just fallen into his lap. Talking to the Nashville officer, Asbury quickly learned that John had a history of violence, and he went to Middle Tennessee State University just like Laura. Asbury hung up and took off for Laura's campus. When he got there, he looked up John's records and began sifting through those, and then he also spoke to some of Laura's friends he'd already met, and it would turn out that Laura and John went to the same fitness center on campus, and they'd gone to a bunch of the same fraternity parties. At this point, Asbury didn't waste any time. He and a state police officer drove right to Nashville to interview John, who was still in custody on the rape charge. John insisted that the sex between him and the woman accusing him of rape was consensual, and he claimed he never said a word about Laura. That was a total lie. And like Asbury's other suspects, John said he'd never gone dancing at a club with Laura, and he said he barely even knew who she was. Asbury left Nashville later that day feeling frustrated. But despite John's claims that he was innocent, the detective thought he made a very strong suspect. However, unless he could find something concrete connecting John or the other young men who were suspects directly to the crime scene on the farmer's land, then he couldn't go after any of them. Over the next several weeks, Detective Asbury continued to work the case every day, but he never felt like he was getting any closer to solving it. Soon, months passed without any new evidence coming in, and Asbury had other cases he had to start focusing on. During this time, Laura's mother came to the sheriff's station often, but every time she asked for an update on her daughter's case, she got the same reply. There was no new information at this time. And Laura's mom got that same response for years. She watched as Laura's friends graduated college and went on with their lives. She saw the young men who had been suspects in her daughter's murder grow up and start families of their own. And she saw Detective Asbury retire and Laura's case go completely cold. Fast forward to February of 2000, almost 16 years after Laura's murder. Two detectives with the Rutherford County Sheriff's Department stood over a conference table staring down at a stack of file folders. These detectives had been assigned to handle cold cases, and their first big case together was Laura Salmon's murder. The lead detective was Lieutenant Bill Sharp, and the detective assisting him was none other than Dan Goodwin, the same young man who had taken Laura out for a movie and dinner shortly before she died, and the same Dan who had promised Laura's mother he would find Laura's killer. Dan, who was now in his 30s, flipped open one of the folders and saw a photo of Laura. Then he began flipping through pages of notes from the original investigation, and as he did, he felt Lieutenant Sharp standing over him. Sharp leaned down and wrote 3 letters across the top of one of Laura's files, DNA. Dan nodded. Technology had come a long way since Laura's murder, and now DNA testing was commonplace and effective and could potentially solve this case. So the first step the investigators took was to connect with the state crime lab. They arranged for a series of tests to be conducted on the blood samples taken from the rocks found at the murder scene and from the 2 pairs of blue jeans that had been left on Laura's body. All the samples had been well preserved, so the lab felt confident they would find something. However, they informed Dan and Lieutenant Sharp that the lab was pretty backed up, and it might take a while to get results. So while they waited, Dan and Lieutenant Sharp began working their way through the files and re-interviewed everyone they could. They also tracked down Laura's old high school boyfriend, Kyle Gilley, and secured a DNA sample from him. And they did the same with John Taylor, the man who had been accused of rape by that young woman in Nashville. And on a day not long after those samples had been sent to the lab, Lieutenant Sharp approached Dan at the station. Sharp tossed a file folder onto Dan's desk and told him, "Now it's your turn." Dan flipped open the file and saw it was a record of his interview from the original investigation. For a second, it threw Dan off. He'd been so caught up in his work that he hadn't thought about himself as being a potential suspect. But he told Sharp that, of course, he would provide a DNA sample. Despite the fact that Dan was a suspect in this case, he was allowed to stay on the investigation, because after he had provided his DNA sample, he was cleared of any wrongdoing. He was not Laura's killer. In the spring of 2000, a couple of months into this new investigation, Dan and Sharp sat at the conference table, digging through Laura's files like they did almost every day. They had conducted interviews, revisited the crime scene, and they had secured DNA samples, but they were still waiting on DNA test results. And they were starting to feel like the original investigators had felt. There were several solid suspects, but not enough evidence to point to any one of them. But that particular day, something in one of the files jumped out at Sharp for the first time. It was a witness statement from a young woman that seemed to have just gone overlooked during the original investigation, and it was potentially a huge break. Lieutenant Sharp pointed it out to Dan, and Dan just stared in shock. Suddenly, he felt like he was close to solving the murder of his friend and keeping his promise to her mother. Both detectives meticulously went through the other files to see if anyone had ever followed up with this witness, but no one ever had. So Dan and Sharp tracked her down. And even though so much time had passed, this witness said she still remembered that day very clearly, and she stood by her original statement. The detectives knew a single statement from over 15 years earlier would not be enough for the district attorney to take a murder case to trial, but they felt like their investigation finally had a clear direction. Then, on May 31st, 2000, 16 years to the day from when Laura's body was found, DNA test results came back from the lab. Dan and Lieutenant Sharp sat at the table and read the report, and both felt completely energized and like they were almost at the end of this investigation. The test results confirmed that the blood on the rocks and on both pairs of jeans was Laura's, but the blood pattern found on the men's jeans could only have occurred if the person wearing them had been on top of Laura when she was struck in the head. So there was now strong evidence that Detective Asbury had been right from the moment he saw Laura's body back in 1984. The men's jeans belonged to the killer. Dan and Sharp kept reading through the results, and as they did, they kept feeling more and more like the witness they had spoken to must have been telling the truth. And then finally, they saw test results that said DNA samples from bodily fluids had been found in the men's jeans, and they had a match for those samples. Dan stepped back from the table, and he felt like he wanted to collapse, like a huge burden had finally been lifted. After all this time, Laura's murder had just been solved. Based on DNA tests, the witness statement, and evidence collected over 16 years during 2 investigations, the following is what police believe happened to Laura Salmon on May 30th, 1984. That afternoon, Laura walked out of the supermarket with her coworker, said goodbye, and then got into her car. As soon as she began driving, she felt like she might fall asleep. She was exhausted from her night out at the club the night before. She drove a few minutes across town and saw her killer waiting for her right outside of their place. Laura parked, got out of the car, and told the killer how exhausted she was. She also said she could only hang out for a little while. The killer said that was totally fine, and they offered to drive since Laura was tired. Laura tossed her car keys to the killer, and then they both climbed into her beige Oldsmobile. The killer immediately had to move the driver's seat way back so they could fit, and then once they were comfortable, they began driving down the main road in town. But a few minutes later, the killer suddenly pulled onto a road that cut through some farmland. Laura asked where they were going, and the killer said it was a surprise. The killer drove a bit longer and then parked the car on the side of the road by a hayfield that was near a rock quarry. Laura looked out the window. She knew the spot from some parties. It was a beautiful day, and Laura was still feeling pretty sleepy, so sitting outside in this field seemed like a nice way to spend some time. However, before Laura could get out of the car, the killer snapped at her and started yelling at her about the night before. Laura yelled right back and said the killer was way out of line, and then she told them to just turn the car around and drive her back to her dorm. But the killer didn't. Instead, they lunged across the front seat, grabbed Laura, and punched her in the face. Laura's eye and her head immediately began throbbing, but she managed to break free from the killer, and she threw the car door open and began running into the field. The killer rushed out of the car, caught up to Laura, and tackled her to the ground. Laura tried to fight back, but the killer was too strong, and they climbed on top of her and pinned her down. Then, the killer reached over, grabbed a rock off the ground, and slammed it into the side of Laura's head multiple times. Blood sprayed from the wounds, and Laura stopped moving. But the killer wasn't done. They dropped that rock and picked up a bigger one, and they raised it up and then slammed it down right square in the middle of Laura's face over and over again. Finally, the killer stopped. They dropped the rock, stood up, and looked down at what they had done. Laura lay there, dead in the grass. The killer began to panic, but they quickly came up with a plan. They ripped off Laura's jacket, her shirt, her jeans, and her underwear, and then stuffed her underwear into Laura's right hand. And then they deliberately posed her legs so her legs were spread open. When the killer stepped back and took a look at their work, they saw Laura's eyes were staring up at them. So they grabbed the jacket and covered most of Laura's face with it. The killer was about to head back to the car, but they looked down and noticed Laura's blood on their jeans. So without thinking, they just took off their jeans. They also grabbed Laura's jeans off the ground, and they laid both pairs across Laura's body. After that, the killer ran back to Laura's car and drove back to the supermarket where Laura worked. After parking the car, the killer scanned the parking lot. When they saw it was all clear, they hopped out and took off running in their underwear. And when they got there, they found their stepfather waiting for them. Laura's high school boyfriend, Kyle Gilley, was her killer. It turned out Kyle was not okay with their breakup, like he had told police. In fact, the idea of Laura seeing anyone other than him filled Kyle with jealousy and rage. So much so that he had begun stalking Laura. And on the night before her murder, he followed her and her date, a man who was never identified, to the club. Kyle hid in the shadows and watched Laura dance all night, and then he followed Laura and her date back to the guy's apartment, and then waited outside while they had consensual sex, and then followed them when Laura's date drove her back to her dorm. The following day, Laura and Kyle had plans to hang out like they still did sometimes, and when Laura handed Kyle her keys, he knew this was his chance to take her out to the middle of nowhere and make her pay for seeing other men. Like a lot of kids in town, Kyle had been to the farmer's land for parties, and he thought it would be a perfect place to confront Laura because nobody else would be around. But as soon as she yelled at him, he couldn't stand it and he punched her. And this was not the first time he had done that. In fact, during the second investigation, Dan and Lieutenant Sharp had discovered Kyle had regularly beaten Laura throughout their high school relationship. This, of course, raised a huge red flag, but it was the overlooked witness statement that enabled them to fully focus their investigation on Kyle. Because back in 1984, a young woman had told police that on the day of Laura's murder, she passed by Kyle driving on the road, and he was driving Laura's beige Oldsmobile, and Laura was not in the car with him. Dan and Lieutenant Sharp never understood why that lead had not been followed up on, and why Kyle and his stepfather's story about grilling steaks together had just been accepted. But with that witness statement, Dan and Sharp were almost positive Kyle was the killer, and DNA test results soon confirmed that theory. In a moment of desperation, Kyle had staged the murder to look like a sexual assault. He hoped it would lead police to the man Laura had gone to the club with and slept with the night before, but when Kyle saw Laura's blood on his jeans, he panicked and left them behind. Because there was no DNA testing at the time, Kyle would never have imagined that remnants of his own bodily fluids inside those jeans would someday allow police to trace the jeans right back to him. Kyle was ultimately sentenced to life in prison, but with a chance for parole in 2042. Kyle's stepfather, who had covered for him in 1984, was deceased by the time Kyle was arrested. Dan had ultimately kept his promise to Laura's mother. He had found her daughter's killer. Dan also said that if he and Kyle are both still alive in 2042, he will be front and center at Kyle's parole hearing, and he'll do everything he can to make sure Kyle never gets out of prison. In the spring of 2021, 52-year-old Texas resident Karen Davis got married, and then after the ceremony and after the honeymoon, she went through the process of changing her last name from Davis to McBride to match her husband's last name. After the change was done, the last step was to get a new driver's license with the new name on it. So Karen emailed the local DMV, or Department of Motor Vehicles, to set up a time for her to come in and make the change to her license. But after she sent that email, the local DMV immediately emailed Karen back, and they told her that they could not help her with this request until she resolved an issue. Now, they didn't specify what this issue was. However, they very cryptically said it had something to do with the state of Oklahoma. And then at the bottom of the email, there was just a phone number they told her she needed to call in order to resolve this issue. And so Karen's thinking, okay, that's pretty weird, but I did used to live in Oklahoma, so that probably has something to do with it. And so, not thinking much of it, she punched this number the DMV had given her into her phone, and then she let it ring. A few moments later, much to Karen's shock, a woman from the Norman, Oklahoma District Attorney's Office picked up the phone and said, "How can I help you?" Karen immediately assumed that the DMV must have made a mistake, that maybe they were trying to give Karen some other number in Oklahoma because this was an Oklahoma problem, and they had mistakenly given her the number to the DA's office. But since she had this woman on the phone, Karen told her, hey, I was just trying to get a new license in Texas. They told me there was some sort of issue. It had to do with me potentially living in Oklahoma. I don't know what it is, but this is the number they gave me. So I'm sure it's a mistake, but that's why I'm calling. The woman from the DA's office had no idea who Karen was, but after taking down Karen's information and looking on her computer, she discovered Karen's so-called Oklahoma problem. And after she explained to Karen what this enormous problem was, Karen literally couldn't believe it. But after this woman went over the details a few more times and really showed Karen that this Oklahoma problem was very, very real, suddenly everything in Karen's life made sense. For the last 22 years, Karen, who was incredibly smart and friendly and polite and never had a problem with anyone, had an incredibly hard time getting a job. Even jobs that she was extremely qualified for, she would get turned down for someone who was way less qualified. And then, in the rare times that Karen did actually get hired, she would always get fired for no reason. And so Karen never understood why she was being treated this way until now. It would turn out 22 years earlier, which is when Karen's hireability issues began, she lived in Norman, Oklahoma, which is where the DA's office was that she would end up calling 22 years later. And when she was living in Norman, she lived with a roommate. And this roommate was this nice young man who had a couple of young kids. And one weekend, he went to the local movie store called Movie Place, and he rented the hit 90s movie Sabrina the Teenage Witch to watch with his kids. And after he was done watching this movie, he didn't return the VHS tape of Sabrina the Teenage Witch back to Movie Place. Now, normally when this happened, the movie store would just hit the card holder with lots of late fees, which was actually great for the movie store. They made lots and lots of money on individual people that just forgot to return their movies. And if the card holder just continued to hold on to this delinquent movie, at some point the movie store would just hit them with a final fee that basically accounted for the total cost of the VHS tape that they had effectively stolen. And then at that point, the matter was resolved. The card holder owned the VHS tape, whether they knew it or not, and the movie store simply moved on. But in this case, Movie Place in Norman, Oklahoma didn't think that was enough. And when Sabrina the Teenage Witch was not returned in a timely fashion, they pressed charges against the cardholder. And the cardholder was Karen Davis. The roommate had just borrowed her card. And somehow, these charges against Karen were never brought up to Karen. She was never contacted by anyone, and so for 22 years, she was technically a wanted felon. Meaning, every time one of her employers, either during the interview process or after she was hired, when they would run a criminal background check on her, it would pop up she was wanted for felony embezzlement. And so this was the reason she kept not getting jobs and kept getting fired from jobs. Since discovering these charges, Karen worked with the Norman, Oklahoma DA's office and got these charges dismissed. Our next story is called The Dark Room. Carlos Camejo woke up freezing cold and totally confused. It was September 6th, 2007, and all Carlos could remember was being on his motorcycle with the hot sun bearing down on him as he wound his way on his bike through the streets of La Victoria, which is a city in Venezuela. Carlos tried to open his eyes, but he couldn't, and then when he tried to move his body, he couldn't do that either. And so he began to panic because he's paralyzed, but he told himself to calm down. If he couldn't move, at least he could think. He could try to process, what's going on here. There has to be an explanation for it. And so Carlos, in total darkness and immobile, began going through over and over again this whole motorcycle trip, which was his last memory. And he remembered that his friend had called him up and asked him to go out on this ride. Carlos used to go out all the time on his bike for fun with his friends and by himself, but now that he was 33 years old and married, he didn't have the time for it as much. But the weather had been so beautiful that when his friend had called and asked to go out, Carlos said, "Let's do it." And so Carlos began going over in his head the route that they had taken through La Victoria, and all he could remember was this long straightaway and then a right turn, and then nothing. It was like after he made that turn, everything went blank. And as Carlos thought about how weird it was that one, he was paralyzed, and two, he had no memory of what happened after he made that right turn, he started to realize that he felt something against his back. It was like there was a block underneath his back, kind of right between his shoulder blades, propping his chest up, and he felt his arms kind of dangling down by the side, and it was very uncomfortable. And as he laid in this totally awkward position, he began to hear somewhere out in the ether, unfamiliar voices just kind of chatting, and immediately Carlos is like, okay, someone's here to help me. I don't know what's wrong with me, but somebody's here, I'm gonna be okay. And soon, whoever was talking near Carlos had moved closer to him, and actually Carlos began to realize that it was actually more than one person. It was at least two people talking back and forth, but again, Carlos can't open his eyes, he can't move, he can't communicate with these people, he just knows they've come closer to him. And after these people had moved right up against Carlos, Carlos suddenly felt something metal pressing up against his chin. And it was kind of sharp, and it kind of hurt when it touched his chin, and Carlos wanted to scream out and tell them whatever they were doing to stop and at least tell him what was going on, but Carlos couldn't make a sound. And then Carlos began to hear this kind of mechanical whirring sound, like a machine starting up that was very close to where he was. And suddenly Carlos began panicking, like, what's going on? What are they doing to me? And as Carlos's heart rate is starting to speed up, one of the people who had moved near Carlos suddenly said, "Oh my God, that's impossible. This can't be." And then again, Carlos felt more pain in his chin. And then the pain got dramatically worse. It went from just kind of like a poking feeling to something going into his chin, and he felt it moving underneath his skin like a knife cutting through him, and then whatever it was, it went out of his chin. And as this is happening, Carlos is trying so hard to just wake himself up and do something to tell these people to stop, but he just couldn't do it. And then again, he felt that sharp pain in his chin. Another round of something going into him, moving underneath his skin and then poking out again. And the pain became so blinding that suddenly Carlos was able to kind of break through this paralysis and his eyes shot open. And for a second, all Carlos could see was like blinding lights. But then as things came into focus, he saw there were two people, the people who had been speaking, wearing these huge goggles and face masks. And one of them was holding a big needle with black thread attached to it. And that thread was coming from Carlos's chin. They had been running that needle through his face, stitching his chin for some reason, but with no anesthetic. And so as Carlos is staring up at these people in goggles, the people in goggles are looking down at Carlos and they're totally horrified and they just kind of begin backing up, not really sure what to make of this. And then Carlos, again, kind of breaking through this weird paralysis he was under, he was able to lift his head up and look down at his body. And he saw, to his horror, that he was totally nude. He was laying on a metal table and there was this Y drawn on his chest, starting at his collarbones, coming down right underneath his throat, and then straight down across his chest. And then after Carlos saw this Y on his naked body, he looked over at a tray that was right next to this metal table near these two guys in goggles who were now kind of backing up. And he saw there was a whirring instrument on this table, and it was a circular blade, a saw. That was the sound he heard. And that's when Carlos figured it out. Earlier that day, when Carlos had been out riding his motorcycle with his friend, he had gone down that long straightaway in La Victoria, he had made a right turn, and parked illegally right after this turn was this big truck. Carlos didn't see it, and at full speed, he impacted the truck, he was thrown from his bike, smashed into the ground, horrific injuries, and when paramedics showed up, they pronounced him dead on the scene. And so he was moved from the scene of the accident to the morgue. And at the morgue, Carlos was stripped naked and put on this metal table, and they placed a block underneath his shoulders, kind of propping his chest up, and they drew a Y down the center of his chest for his autopsy. The two doctors that Carlos ultimately saw chatting and performing this autopsy were going to follow that Y on his body with the circular saw. That's how they cut you open during an autopsy. But right before they were about to do that, the doctors noticed that Carlos was actively bleeding from his chin. And since he was supposed to be dead, that didn't make any sense. And so that was why one of the doctors had said, "Oh my goodness, this can't be." And so not really sure what to make of it, they had just grabbed a needle and begun stitching his face together to stop the blood from going down his chest. And then Carlos opened his eyes and it dawned on the two doctors that, oh, he's alive. That's why he's still bleeding. We should definitely take care of him now. But amazingly, after Carlos came back from the dead, he was simply moved into the hallway and left on this metal table, and the doctors who were going to perform his autopsy just left the paper that said he needed an autopsy in his pocket, just kind of showing that, hey, we were just following orders. Somebody told us to give you an autopsy. This is not our fault. And that's where Carlos stayed, until his wife showed up and found him in the hallway just laying there as if he was still just waiting for his autopsy. Carlos would suffer horrible injuries from the accident and serious emotional trauma from almost being cut open during this autopsy, but he would make a full recovery.
The next and final story of today's episode is called Timothy Dexter.
In the winter of 1748, Timothy Dexter was born in a town just north of Boston, Massachusetts called Malden. Despite being incredibly dim-witted, Timothy always believed he was going to strike it rich one day. But looking around at his family, who were a bunch of poor farm laborers, Timothy realized he would need to make some big moves if he wanted that dream to become a reality. When he was just 8 years old, he decided he would make the first of his many big moves. And this move was to drop out of second grade and go to work on a farm and then on to a leather tannery. For years, he worked hard, earning more money than his family had ever made, but he knew this line of work was not going to make him rich. And so, when he was 19 years old, he decided it was time to make yet another big move. He sold his best suit and used the money to relocate farther north to another Massachusetts town called Newburyport. He believed with their booming economy, he was bound to make some additional money there. And he was right, but his payday would not come from a higher paying job. When he arrived there, he met a lonely, wealthy widow named Elizabeth Frothingham, and he promptly married her, becoming rich overnight. After moving into her mansion and dubbing himself Lord Timothy Dexter, he suddenly felt lost. He had spent his entire life pursuing wealth, and now that he suddenly had it, he didn't know what to do with it. And so he looked around Newburyport at the other rich people and saw what they were doing, and he found that many of them held political positions. And so Timothy decided he would run for office too. But unfortunately, the voters caught on to the fact that he was a second grade dropout who couldn't read or write or think critically, so he didn't win the election. But instead of accepting his defeat, Timothy began petitioning the town to let him have his political office anyways. And the town said, no, that's not how democracy works, but Timothy didn't really understand, and he just continued to send these carefully outlined petitions explaining exactly why they needed to appoint him. The town had to bring in experts that were able to decipher what he wrote, because Timothy was deeply illiterate, and his petitions were so riddled with spelling mistakes and were so confusing that at first glance it looked like it was written in a foreign language. After they deciphered them, they would immediately deny them, but Timothy just continued to send them. And so finally the town got so fed up with all of his petitions that they decided they would just give him a fake political title just to get him to stop, and to low-key humiliate him. They offered him the title of the Informer of Deer, and they told him his job was to look high and low all over Newburyport for any signs of deer activity. And the joke was, in Newburyport, there are no deer. But Timothy did not find this humiliating. He did not see the joke in it. He took it very seriously and believed his petitions had worked. And so he took his political title, and with great enthusiasm, he got to work, spending all hours running all around the town, carefully documenting all deer activity, of which there was none. At the end of his term, Timothy felt like he had accomplished a lot as the Informer of Deer and was ready to move on from political office. And so he turned in his official Informer of Deer logbook to the town and told them they should pass it along to the next Informer of Deer to get them up to speed. Unfortunately, when the town opened that logbook, they found it contained only crude pictures of deer and then illiterate ramblings about deer that were so difficult to decipher that even the experts weren't able to do it. And so the logbook was thrown away, and the Informer of Deer position was never filled again. Shortly after the American Revolutionary War broke out between the colonies in America and Great Britain, America began printing their own money to pay for their troops. But this money, called the Continental Dollar, it wasn't backed by silver or gold. It was just backed on the promise of future value if America won the war. That, combined with overprinting this money, led to rampant inflation, and very quickly the Continental Dollar was worthless. Some of the wealthy folk in Newburyport decided they would do the troops a favor, who were now destitute because they held all of this worthless currency. And these wealthy people offered to buy all of their continental currency for a fraction of the price, which was better than nothing. When Timothy saw all these rich people doing that, he quickly jumped on the trend. But he didn't view this as doing a favor for these troops that needed the money. He viewed this as a great investment opportunity. He believed America was going to win this war and that eventually this currency was going to have lots of value. And so he invested all of his savings into buying back the Continental Dollar. When word spread that Timothy had made this terrible investment, because at the time, nobody was predicting this currency would have any worth, really even if America won the war. When they found out that Timothy had made this ridiculous investment, his peers, the other wealthy folk in Newburyport, they were thrilled. They were so annoyed by Timothy, and they didn't like the fact that he was kind of on their level because he had some money, and so they were excited to see him go bankrupt. But sure enough, at the end of the American Revolution, when America won the war, Congress made good and backed the currency, making Timothy one of the richest people in America overnight. Right away, Timothy used his second big windfall of cash to purchase the most luxurious mansion in the richest neighborhood in all of Newburyport. But beyond that purchase, he didn't really know what to do with all of this money. It was very overwhelming. And so after several weeks of deep introspection where he tried to figure out, who he was now and what he wanted to be, it suddenly became clear to him. He needed to construct 40 wooden statues of random famous men on his front lawn. These statues included George Washington, Napoleon Bonaparte, Thomas Jefferson, and of course himself. The inscription under his statue read, "The first in the East, the first in the West, and the greatest philosopher in the Western world." After a sculptor was done, Timothy went out to inspect all 40 statues, and he discovered what he believed to be a huge discrepancy on one of them. Underneath Thomas Jefferson's replica, it said the author of the Declaration of Independence, which is accurate. But he told the sculptor that he was supposed to put down the author of the Constitution. And the sculptor very gently said, "That's not right, it should be the Declaration of Independence." Timothy became irate, he was not having it, and so he ran into his mansion and came out with his oversized hunting rifle and began firing at the sculptor's feet until he made the change. After Jefferson's title was fixed, Timothy noticed another discrepancy on another statue. He walked over to the George Washington replica and looked underneath it at the inscription which said George Washington. And Timothy just shook his head, got out a paintbrush, covered it up, and wrote one word, Pitt. Just Pitt. Because periodically Timothy would confuse George Washington's name with Pitt, and nobody could convince him otherwise. By now, the other wealthy folk in Newburyport had really grown to resent Timothy. And now he was just showing off his wealth with his totally ridiculous mansion and all of his statues. And so some of these aristocrats wanted to find a way to just ruin Timothy. And so knowing he was not a very bright man, they decided they would start giving him deliberately terrible investment tips. The first being that he should buy a whole bunch of warming pans and send them to the Caribbean. A warming pan is like this big frying pan that you load up with hot coals and you slide under your bed to stay warm at night. This works really well in a cold environment like Newburyport, but is completely worthless in a warm tropical environment like the Caribbean. But Timothy believed he was being given some great insider trading information and absolutely took this to the bank. And he went and bought 2 ships and he loaded them up with 40,000 of these huge warming pans and he fired them off to the Caribbean. And when they got there, the locals didn't know what they were or what they were for, but they found these warming pans served as great ladles for molasses. And they all sold out for a huge profit. And so Timothy went to those aristocrats and he thanked them for their incredible investment tip. These rich people were furious that their plan had backfired, and so they decided they would pitch him another, even worse investment tip that was bound to ruin him. They told him, "Why don't you buy up a whole bunch of coal and send it to Newcastle, England?" Newcastle being the coal capital of the world, where there was so much coal there was actually an expression at the time, "That's like sending coal to Newcastle," which meant you're doing something completely pointless. But these fine rich folks had never done Timothy wrong, and so he took their advice and once again took it to the bank. He loaded up his ships with coal and he sent them off to Newcastle. And this would have ruined him had it not been for the coal workers' strike that occurred right before his shipment arrived. And so when Timothy's coal arrived on the shores of Newcastle, there was a coal shortage and all of his coal sold out for another huge profit. And so once again, Timothy went back to the aristocrats and said, "Thank you for the incredible advice." Now truly irate that their plan has backfired 2 times, these aristocrats got together and said, "Okay, we gotta set him up for something that's going to make him fail." And so they pitched him one more terrible investment tip. This was, "Hey Timothy, why don't you go buy all the whalebone you possibly can? Just hoard it, keep it in your house, because someday it's going to get really valuable." At the time, whalebone was extremely expensive and losing its value every single day. But again, Timothy thinks, these people have never done me wrong, I'm going to do just that. And so he went out and he collected thousands of pounds of these rotting whale bones and made a huge stockpile in his basement. And shortly after he had built up this mountain of bone, over in France, it became fashionable for men to wear corsets. And wouldn't you know it, these corsets were made out of whalebone. And so once again, Timothy's investment completely paid off. And so he tipped his hat for a 3rd time to these rich folks that just keep making him more and more money. After these 3 big investment wins, Timothy was very confident and he viewed himself as a shrewd investor. And so he began to believe that he could identify winning investments himself. And so the first winning investment that he identified was to purchase all these stray cats in Newburyport that were lined up for euthanization. Timothy figured these mangy, sick, feral animals would make great house pets in the Caribbean. And so he loaded them all onto his 2 ships, he fired them across the sea, and wouldn't you know it, they sold like hotcakes. Not because they were cute and cuddly, but because, unbeknownst to Timothy, the Caribbean had a huge rat infestation problem in their warehouses, and so his shipment of stray cats arrived at the perfect time. At some point, after all these successful investments, Timothy started to wonder about his legacy. How would people remember him after he was gone? And so there was only one way to find out. Timothy, very elaborately, faked his own death. And as he hid, watching his funeral, he noticed his wife, Elizabeth, wasn't as sad as he thought she should be over the death of her husband. And so he leapt out in front of the thousands of people that were there, and he began beating his wife with his cane. After this, Timothy decided he didn't really like his wife anymore, and so he decided he would just tell people she was dead, even though she was not dead. And so when people came to Timothy's mansion and they saw his wife walking around, clearly alive, Timothy would tell them, "Oh, she's a ghost." And because at this point Timothy was so wealthy and so influential, people just kind of accepted this and began viewing Elizabeth as a ghost. Before Timothy's actual death, he penned an autobiography called A Pickle for the Knowing Ones, a title that to this day people still don't really understand. Inside the book were 24 pages of completely illiterate ramblings with absolutely 0 punctuation. The book was so terrible that it actually sold out very quickly because people thought it was funny to buy this book. After people criticized Timothy for not using any punctuation, Timothy printed a 2nd edition where at the very end he included a single page with 13 lines of just random punctuation marks with a note at the bottom that said, "Go ahead and sprinkle these in as you see fit." In 1806, just a few years after publishing his book, Lord Timothy Dexter, the informer of deer, quietly passed away. This time for real. In the 2000s, a teenager named Eben and his father would regularly go hunting in the Georgia backcountry. When Eben turned 14, his father befriended a very wealthy landowner in Georgia who offered them access to one of his best private hunting areas. And just a couple of days later, on October 5th, Eben and his father would take him up on the offer. They woke up super early and they drove out to the edge of this property that was actually fenced in. And they went to a main gate where they had the combo that this guy had given them. They punched in the combo, opened up the gate, drove in, shut the gate, locked it, and then continued down the access road. They followed this road for about 2 miles where it came to a stop right outside of this huge forest. They parked their truck, they got out, they put on their gear, and in the pre-morning darkness began hiking into the woods. Even though they were there primarily to hunt, Eben and his father secretly enjoyed just hiking around the woods and camping out, and any chance they got to extend their hunting trips, they would, even if the hunting wasn't good. And so since they spent a ton of time in the woods together, They noticed almost immediately when they walked into this particular forest that something was off. There's no birds, there's no animals. Silence. It's just totally silent. The only sounds they heard that were not them was a single plane that passed overhead. Although they found this very odd, they figured, you know what, this is private property, not a lot of people are out here. I'm sure as soon as we showed up, the animals were aware of us and they've scattered. They finally make it out to the hunting stand that the owner had told them about. They get all settled in, they're getting ready to see some animals. And all day long, they don't see a single animal. They don't hear a single animal. In fact, again, it is just completely silent. Frustrated, they began packing up their stuff, making their way down off the stand, and they started looking for a place to make camp for the night. And Eben's father suggested, well, hey, there's obviously nothing over here. It's been quiet all day. Why don't we walk deeper into the woods a little ways, set up camp there, so tomorrow we have a better chance of seeing some animals. So they hiked for about an hour farther away from where they parked their truck, and they reached this clearing, which is perfect for setting up their camp. And so they set up their tent, and Eben's father says, hey, we still got some daylight. Do you want to go try our luck and see if we can see some animals out here now? Eben's like, yeah, why not? So they hike a little ways away from their campsite and they set up their blind, and once again, they don't see any animals. It's totally quiet. And so they turn around and they start heading back. As soon as they could see their campsite, which really was just their tent, they noticed that their tent was now collapsed. And Eben's father turns to him and says, oh, it must have been the wind. And Eben says, no, it couldn't have been the wind, because all day today we have been commenting on how quiet it is and how the fact that there's no weather, no wind, no anything is heightening the fact that it's completely silent. So it could not have been wind. So Eben's father is like, well, when you set the tent up, did you not put the posts into the eyelets? Did you not build it correctly? And Eben's like, no, I've made that tent like 1,000 times. I know it was set up correctly. They walk into their campsite and they look down at their tent, and they're really confused at what they see. The two rods that go in an X over the top of the tent that thread through nylon loops and then anchor at 4 different points on the base of the tent, well, they had been removed from the 4 corners. And if you know how a tent works, it works on tension. And once you have a rod anchored in 2 points, it doesn't just pop out. It's anchored at 2 sides. It's actually difficult to remove each anchor. Once one is out, the other comes out easily. But basically, the rod would need to break in order for it to come out of those anchor points, or someone would have to come over and remove it. And they didn't remove them, and none of the rods were broken, which leaves them with either they failed to set up their tent, even though they had distinct and clear memories of setting it up and double checking it was set up because they put gear inside of it, or someone came over to their campsite while they were gone and undid the 4 corners. They decide, you know what, it can't be some stranger coming over here because we're the only ones with the gate combo. This is private property and no one could have been here. And why would they do that if they came to our campsite? Why would they randomly collapse our tent and then vanish? So it had to be us. We must have not made the tent. And while they didn't really believe that they had not made their tent, they convinced themselves that that's what happened because the alternative was just too bizarre and frankly terrifying to consider. So they build their tent and they make a little fire and they stay up for a little while chatting before being tired and saying, okay, let's just go to bed. They extinguish the fire, they get in the tent, and they both fall asleep. A couple hours later, Eben wakes up suddenly and he's not sure if he's dreaming or not, but he thinks he hears someone laughing a couple 100 meters behind their tent off in the woods. Eben instinctively turns to make sure his dad is still in the tent with him, and he is. And then Eben starts listening really intently to what's happening outside. And all he can hear is silence, like it's been since they got in the woods. He doesn't hear any more laughter, and so he says, okay, I must have just been dreaming, and there wasn't any laughter out there, and eventually Eben goes back to sleep. A little while later, Eben wakes up suddenly again, except this time his dad is already awake and looking around anxiously. And Eben sits up and goes, what's going on? And his dad goes, shh. And he goes, can you hear that? And Eben listens, and to his horror, he hears laughing. He wasn't dreaming before. Eben also realizes the laughter is not coming from the same area he heard it. It's now coming from the opposite direction, and it's a lot closer to them. Eben very quietly and carefully explains to his dad that he actually heard this laughter a couple hours earlier. And Eben's father turns to Eben and says, before we came out here, I asked the owner, should we expect any other hunters or campers or anybody nearby? And the owner said, this is private property and it's fenced in. There is no one there but you guys. After this revelation, they both turn their attention back to just listening because they're hoping this is just going to stop and whatever this is just going to leave. but it doesn't leave. They hear footsteps running towards them from way off in the forest, and it's so quiet, it's really easy to hear these footsteps. And whatever this is charging towards them. And then it comes to a complete stop right at the edge of their clearing. At this point, Eben is now grabbing onto his father. Eben's father is holding onto his rifle, and he's getting ready to open the tent to confront whatever is out there. And right before he grabs the zipper, this person, whatever it is, starts laughing again, and it's practically right on top of them. It's so loud. They can hear it clear as day right there, right outside their tent. And Eben's father takes a deep breath. He grabs the zipper, and as soon as he begins moving it, the sound the zipper made causes the laughter to stop. They don't hear footsteps, so they know probably something's still out there. But the laughter stops like it's recognized that they're making noise. They're right there. There they are. They're in the tent. Eben's father freezes with his hand on this zipper, and he's debating whether he should go outside or not. And before he can even make that decision, whatever this thing is turns around and runs back into the woods, and it's just gone. And for several minutes, they just sit like that in total silence, praying that whatever this is gone for good. And after several minutes, when they don't hear anything, there's no more laughing, there's no more running, Eben's father re-zips up the tent, puts his hand back down, and they're both left just sitting there thinking, what the heck just happened? Eben and his father would stay up all night, and they would barely speak, because whatever this thing was had heard them when they moved the zipper. And so they were really afraid of making any sound, even little sounds, because it's so quiet, sound travels really far, and they don't know who or what is out there. And so in silence, holding their guns, they're just waiting for the sun to come up. And as soon as it did, they were up and out of there, literally running out of the forest, checking over their shoulder the whole time, all the way back to their truck. And so to this day, they have no idea who or what the heck was running around out there. And they told the owner of the property about it. And the owner just said, it's not possible. We have a totally gated in private piece of property, and there are cameras watching the only entrance. And you are the only ones that went in or out over that time period. And prior to that, we monitor this property. Nobody else was in there. In the summer of 2013, a young woman named Katie and her father decided to go camping at one of their favorite campgrounds in the Sierra Nevada mountain range. Katie loved going camping with her father because he was this totally accomplished outdoorsman, and he used to be a wilderness guide for much of his life, and so she just always felt like she was in great hands whenever she was out in the wild with him, and she had kind of become a fairly accomplished outdoorswoman herself. When they arrived at the campground, the parking lot was packed with cars. And they're like, shoot, I wish we'd called ahead a couple weeks ago and reserved a site because they're probably not even available now. But they went to the front desk and they were like, you're in luck, we have one available, but it's the one that's way over there. It was this one campsite that was kind of isolated from the rest of the campground. It was far away from the bathhouse, it was far away from where you go swimming, and it was far away from the parking lot. It was just like really inconvenient. And whenever they came camping here, it was like the one site they didn't want to use. But beggars can't be choosers. They were happy to even have a site. And so they drove all the way down this little road into this very isolated campsite, kind of in the middle of this forest. Once they got there, they began setting up their respective tents because they were not going to be staying in the same tent. They each had these very small backpacking tents, which were so small that you could either zip it up all the way and stay warmer and more protected, but you had to sleep in a ball because your legs would not fit otherwise. Or you could unzip the front of your tent, and when you lay down, you could extend your legs fully, but your legs are protruding outside of your tent. So you could only do that in warmer weather and if you were comfortable having your legs poking out into the wilderness. After they set up their tents and they get their coolers set up and they have all their stuff kind of the way they want it, they go out hiking for the rest of the day. When they come back, they're totally exhausted, they fall asleep, and nothing of note occurs over that first night. The next day they get up, they go back out, they go hiking all day all over again, and they come back that night and they are totally exhausted again. And they get into their tents and they go to bed. And this night, something of note would happen. At about 3 a.m., Katie wakes up and she hears footsteps walking towards the campsite from a little ways off. They're in the woods somewhere. And she's thinking, okay, it's got to be my father because he's diabetic and every night he gets up to go to the bathroom maybe 3-4 times, and he probably was just walking to the bathhouse and now he's walking back. But she realizes the bathhouse is over here, not over here. So what is he doing walking towards the campsite from this side? The footsteps come out of the tree line, they come into the clearing that is their campsite, and they stop about 2-3 meters outside of Katie's tent. Now, there were no windows on Katie's backpack tent. There was just little vents at the front and the back that kind of pointed down, and so she couldn't see out anyways, and there was no illumination out, so you can't even pick up a silhouette. It's just total darkness out there. She can't see who's out there. She can only hear them. But she's thinking, okay, maybe my dad got lost coming back from the bathhouse because he didn't have a flashlight and he walked too far. That's possible. Or, he could have decided to relieve himself just in the tree line, even though he's not known to do that. He's a guy that goes to the bathhouse. And so she's running through these scenarios that are convincing her that, oh, that's just my dad. But what she really wants to hear is that person walk away from her tent and get into her father's tent, because that will confirm in her mind that that was her father. And so she's sitting here waiting for that confirmation, and she hears the footsteps again, but instead of walking around her tent to her father's tent, this person walks right up against her tent very quickly. And they clearly begin leaning over her little tiny tent because she can hear them breathing right above her. And this is when she realizes, that's not my dad. And as she's having this terrible revelation that some stranger is outside her tent right now, she has an even worse revelation. It was a warm night that night, so she was sleeping with her tent unzipped and her legs poking out the end. She musters the courage to begin slowly retracting her legs back inside of her tent. But before she's able to do that, this person stands up, turns, and starts walking towards the base of her tent where her legs are. She's completely frozen and terrified about what's about to happen. But this person doesn't stop at her feet. They keep moving and in fact start circling her tent. But because they were making a lot of noise and walking around her, it allowed her to pull her legs back into her tent without, this person hearing her. And so she had the illusion of safety being inside of her tent, but her tent is still unzipped. So she's waiting for this person to come around and crouch down and look inside of her tent because it's open. And so she's just looking down there hoping that doesn't happen. But unfortunately, right at this moment, the person walked to the base of her tent and came to a stop right outside where the opening to the tent is. And so she's sitting there thinking, please don't come in here, please don't come in here, please don't come in here. And even though her feet are pulled up into her tent, she suddenly feels something pinch her foot, and she knows it's a hand. Something has grabbed my foot. And she stifles a scream and she starts shaking uncontrollably because her instincts are telling her, don't let this person know you're awake. And luckily, as she's sitting there shaking from fear and trying to be quiet as best as she can, she's holding her mouth. This person stands back up again and goes back to the spot next to her tent and leans over the tent once again, and she can hear them breathing right over her. And so for several minutes, she lay there shaking with this random person who pinched her foot a minute ago, hovering over her tent in the middle of the night. And she has nothing she can do. And she's just quiet. She's hoping it's going to end soon. And eventually this person would turn around and walk over to their cooler and their table and some other things that were out. And she hears some rummaging going on. Some things are being moved around. And then this person just kind of walks off into the distance. But she doesn't know if they're gone. She doesn't know if they're standing in the edge of the tree line waiting for her to come outside. Maybe they laid a trap for her. And so she just lays there, silent, doesn't move, and she's praying to herself, please don't let anything happen to me or my father. And all night she's just laying there. And then eventually she does fall asleep. Probably hours go by, but she does fall asleep because she wakes up again when she hears her father unzipping his tent. And she charges out to meet him. And she can tell right away that he's scared. And before she can even say or begin to describe what's happened to her, he says, were you outside your tent last night at about 2-3 in the morning? Because I heard all sorts of commotion near our cooler. I wasn't sure if it was an animal. I wasn't sure if it was you. And she starts telling him, no, this is what happened to me. And as she's describing what happened to her, he looks behind her at the picnic table, which was next to their cooler, and they had their backpacks on it. Basically anything that didn't fit in their tents, they kept near this picnic table. And he points at it. And she turns around, and any item that was in the cooler or in their backpacks or that was just out has been stacked in a pyramid formation on this table. Clearly, the guy who was here last night did this for some reason they don't understand. And as they go over to look at it to see if anything's been taken, they notice this track of footprints, like these heavy footprints that have been going around and around Katie's tent. So she clearly wasn't imagining it. And so that instant, they packed everything up, got in their car, and they left. And to this day, they can barely talk about it with each other because it's all the things that could have happened. The father felt horribly guilty because he clearly heard this person, but didn't leave his tent. And his daughter was clearly in danger. And his daughter's thinking, the tent was open. This person was crouched down, reaching into my tent, grabbing my feet. Like, that's such a horrifying image. And so this has been completely traumatizing for them, and they just don't talk about it anymore.
Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. There's this one, of course, the Mr. Ballin podcast, and there's Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, Redacted, and Late Nights with Nexpo. All you have to do is search for Ballin Studios wherever you get your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like